This video is called Evolution. I read a flyer the other day inviting people to a gathering. On the flyer was a quote that said this: "Humanity is now faced with a stark choice, evolve or die. If the structures of the human mind remain unchanged, we will always end up recreating the same world, the same evils, and the same dysfunction." I understand what he is saying, and I agree with the sentiment very much. Humanity does now face a stark choice, change or die. However, this stark choice that he speaks of has been facing humanity for millennia already. It's always been the same, and people have gone both ways about it. But it is without a doubt the case that for thousands of years, humanity has already recreated the same world with the same evils and dysfunctions. This is pretty obvious and apparent. So the author of this quote is not really telling us anything new. Human beings have already realized this truth for thousands of years. This quote gives the impression that this choice is only now upon us. But the reality of the situation is that this choice has been upon us for centuries and centuries and eons and even longer, as long as human beings have been around. It is not saying anything that any number of thinkers and theologians and philosophers have not said before now. However, I agree most heartily with his assertion that if the structures of the human mind remain unchanged, the human race will always end up recreating the same world, the same evils, and the same dysfunction. That I agree with very much. But I would like to add some thoughts to his. The structures that exist in the human mind are those that have been created as human beings have, quote, eaten, unquote, from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Over and over and over again throughout all of human history. Eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil creates structures in the human mind that are based upon that knowledge. It is inevitable. However, since it is the case that good and evil are simply two sides of the same coin, any structures in the human mind that are based upon this dualistic paradigm of reality are doomed to failure. Why? Because in any mindset or reality based upon and founded upon the knowledge of good and evil, you can never have one without the other. So, no matter how much good one may achieve, one remains susceptible to evil. The only way to escape this dualistic nightmare is to leave off of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil altogether. The only way to create structures in the human mind that are not based upon dualism, yin and yang, good and evil, is to stop eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and return to eating from the tree of life. Because life is the only alternative to the knowledge of good and evil. You either have one or you have the other. This idea is put forth in the first couple chapters of the Bible. I don't know if the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is or was a literal tree, and I don't know all of the particulars of the story, and I don't know if it's just a metaphor or not. Many people say many different things about the Bible and the stories that are contained therein. But regardless, the concept is certainly true. Eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, no matter how it has happened, has certainly gotten humanity in a mess full of evils and dysfunction, as the quote stated. And it is certainly the case that something must change or more people will die, as has been happening for eons already past. So, we must certainly change. But simply evolving, as stated in the quote, will not do it, unless you count learning to eat from the tree of life instead of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as evolving. But the only way to stop eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and begin eating from the tree of life is through Christ. So call it evolving or call it whatever you like, but the fact is that humanity must leave off eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the only way to do that is to return to God and, quote, eating, unquote, from Him, and, quote, eating, unquote, from Christ. Feeding on God and on Christ will lead us to life and get us off of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because where does all life come from? From God. We must return to the source of life itself, and that source is God. Because knowledge alone is not enough. Many have knowledge, but that knowledge does not inherently make them good. It just makes them knowledgeable. But knowledge apart from God and apart from Christ has no life in and of its own. It is simply knowledge, no matter how great the knowledge may be. Many over the years have amassed large amounts of knowledge, and that knowledge has actually hurt them more than it has helped them. It is common knowledge that some people's great learning can actually drive them mad. See Acts 26, verse 24 in the Bible. I imagine that there are plenty of people living on the streets and in hospitals who majored in knowledge, but it didn't actually have the power to give them life, so it drove them mad. Only God has the power to give us life. In fact, Christ is a, quote, life-giving spirit, unquote. That is in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 45 out of the Bible. Many people now recognize the truth that the author of this quote spoke of, and many people have recognized this truth for millennia before us. And many have come together to try to do something about it, and no doubt some good things have come from their efforts. But to simply get a lot of people together to talk about it ultimately won't help unless Christ and God are involved. Because returning to Christ and to God is the only way to get off of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So people who gather together to tackle this huge problem, but who remain stuck on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, apart from the source of all life, God Himself, will simply remain stuck on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They may come up with a lot of good strategies, plans, ideas, etc., but in the end, those plans and strategies will not be able to save us from the fruit of that tree. Why? Because as long as you are eating from that tree, you are susceptible to evil, no matter how much good you achieve. This is why, no matter how much good has been achieved over the years by those who address this stark choice that humanity has, the human race is still plagued with the same evils and the same dysfunction. Because it doesn't matter how much good you achieve, no matter how revolutionary your reforms, and no matter how stellar your accomplishments, unless you tap into the tree of life, Christ, you remain stuck on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And as long as you are stuck there, the structures in your mind cause you to remain susceptible to evil. Human history illustrates all of this to the nth degree. So we need to rethink our strategy. We need to find out how to truly change the structures within the human mind to structures of life instead of structures of good and evil. And the way to do this is to tap into the life of God in Christ. Because only then will human beings truly, quote, evolve, unquote, into something better than what we've experienced up to this point.